Good evening. Uh, this is an overview of the general pediatric surgical questions that you most commonly will be encountering in various All India examinations. I am Dr. Arvind Radhakrishnan. I had my graduate training from CHIPMA and pediatric surgical training from Maulana Azad Medical College, New Delhi. So I'll take you through the short and crisp presentation for today. So these will be the contents of my slides today. What is the scope of pediatric surgery in India? A brief uh, on Assure's online coaching program. A few model MCQs that you may encounter in your exams. These are a wide range of questions. So today's session is only to give you a gist on the spectrum that you may encounter and to a summary and conclusion. All due credits have been given to the corporate material used in the presentation, and I thank all the parents and caregivers for consenting to utilize the clinical photographs of their babies. The presentation is solely intended for educational purposes of medical professionals only. So, can we move on? A 12-hour-old male neonate, term neonate, born of spontaneous vaginal delivery with complaints of recurrent vomiting immediately after feeds. The child was brought to the pediatric surgeon with complaints of repeated vomiting of fresh feeds after immediately after feeding. And on going through the antenatal investigations, we find that there was history of polyhydramnios, and the mother says the child passed meconium at birth. Chest X-ray was done, and it shows the following finding. Which of the following best fits the scenario, or which of these is the best clinical diagnosis? Option A, congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Option B, esophageal atresia with tracheoesophageal fistula. Option C, Hirschsprung's disease. And option D, esophageal atresia without tracheoesophageal fistula. Among these, when we see most of the questions related to pediatric surgery, it will be in the level of what you can answer if you go through Subiston and Bailey and Love. But of late, they have started asking more of clinical scenarios and more from core pediatric surgical textbooks like Ashcraft, Quran, and other pediatric surgical subspecialty books like Kelalis and Piso Poplar. So this is a very standard and common question aimed more on the NEET PG level question, and I think easily you can um, choose rule out two of these options. Since there is a coiling of orogastric tube here, you can pick one of esophageal atresia with TEF and esophageal atresia without TEF. The lung fields on both sides are clear, so there is no question of diaphragmatic hernia, and it is a chest X-ray and not focusing more on the abdomen. So um, you won't think of Hirschsprung's disease in the first place. So out of these two, EA with TEF and EA without TEF, uh, what would be the best fitting the scenario? The answer for this would be esophageal atresia with a tracheoesophageal fistula. The key to noticing this or coming to this conclusion is that there is coiling, fine, so that points towards esophageal atresia, but there is also presence of bowel gas, which means that there is a fistula wide enough allowing the air that has been entering the esophagus and the upper airway to reach the intestine or the GIT. So there should be some communication between the GI and the respiratory tract. So this is one of the common this thing that has been asked, where many tend to make a mistake, and there has been sufficient time. It is a 12-hour-old neonate, so there has been sufficient time for the bowel gas to develop in this case. So coming to esophageal atresia with the tracheoesophageal fistula, the incidence is 1 in 2,500 to 1 in 3,000 live births. There is a slight male preponderance of 1.2:1. Antenatal exposure to methimazole, OCPs, alcohol, thalidomide, and maternal diabetes have been implicated in the pathogenesis. Antenatal exposure to methimazole has been asked in one of the past examinations. Let's come to the embryo pathogenesis of this particular condition. We all know that in the picture, the yellow shows the foregut, and the blue denotes the respiratory tract, which is the laryngotracheal diverticulum and the lung buds. Around the 4th week of intranatal period, the sorry, the laryngotracheal diverticulum forms as a outpouch from the anterior wall of the foregut tube. There are two ridges on either side, which are the tracheoesophageal grooves, which fuse in the midline to separate the trachea and the esophagus. So this particular fusion is controlled by genes such as bone morphogenetic protein 4 and NOG genes. And there is a controversy whether this division occurs mediolaterally or craniocaudally. So there are still studies going on in mice and rabbits to prove the exact pathogenesis, to justify the exact site of the fistula with the embryo pathogenesis. But as of now, the theory that has been proposed and that has been accepted is the lateral formation of the esophageotracheal ridges, which fuse in the midline, and finally leading to a pinching off of the respiratory tract from the foregut tube. Types of esophageal atresia. There are 6 types of esophageal atresia. 5 are depicted here. The first picture shows here shows the normal anatomy of the esophagus and the stomach and the respiratory tract behind. Okay. The type A, which is called a pure esophageal atresia, in which there is no abnormality of the respiratory tract, but there is a atresia of the esophagus. So there is a upper pouch, there is a lower pouch, and there is a discontinuity, and which is not communicating with the respiratory tract. This is type A, or isolated or a pure esophageal atresia. Type B is atresia with a proximal fistula. That is, the proximal or upper pouch has a fistula with the respiratory tract, with the usually the right bronchus or directly with the trachea, and the lower pouch is a continuity with the stomach, but there is no communication with the upper pouch. The type C, the commonest one, around forming 85 to 87%, is the type C esophageal atresia, wherein there is a blind ending upper pouch and there is a fistula of the lower pouch with the right main bronchus or the trachea. The type D, which is double fistula, the upper pouch and lower pouch, they separately form fistulae with the respiratory tract. And there is a type E, wherein the esophagus and the respiratory tract are separately formed in full continuity, but there is a communication between these two passages. So there is also a type F, wherein the esophagus is completely formed. It is separate from the trachea, but there is a congenital stricture or stenosis of the esophagus. So the congenital esophageal stenosis is categorized by some authors as a type F esophageal atresia. Okay, so these are all categorizations given by gross anatomical classifications. So what are the other classifications of esophageal atresia? This has been asked in one of the past examinations. The oldest classification is by Vogt, VOGT, and the next classification is given by Ladd, Dr. Ladd. So Ladd and Gross are considered as doyens in pediatric surgery, especially pediatric thoracic surgery. So these are the three common classifications that are being tested in the various examinations. And there are other names associated with esophageal atresia where extensive studies have been done. Waterston, Spitz, Okamoto. What are these? These are the various survival or prognostic classifications of children born with esophageal atresia. These don't have any role in categorizing the type of esophageal atresia. These three systems are prognostic uh, categorizations. So what are the syndromic associations? There are around 6 to 8% cases with syndromic associations in esophageal atresia. Trisomy 18 or Edwards syndrome and trisomy 21, the most common congenital chromosomal anomaly, which is Down syndrome, are known to have wide associations with esophageal atresia. The other genes that have been associated are the NMIC gene with the Feingold syndrome. NMIC will be encountered commonly in other pediatric oncology section. The NMIC the NMIC amplification is associated as a poor prognostic marker in neuroblastoma. So it's point worthy noting it. And a CHD7 mutation is associated with Charge syndrome, coloboma, heterochromia iridis, heart anomalies, anorectal malformations, mental retardation, genitourinary anomalies, and esophageal atresia. The SOX2 gene mutation is associated with AEG syndrome, which has the components of genital anomalies, esophageal atresia, and auricular defects. Occasionally, as a part of the Smith-Lemli-Opitz syndrome, Townsbrook syndrome, or the auriculovertebral syndrome, Fryns and Fanconi's anemia. Other system anomalies that are associated with esophageal atresia. So the Bacterial association should never be forgotten in dealing with any of these children who are brought with esophageal atresia. It is so important that if you identify one of these anomalies, it is always a thumb rule in pediatric surgery to look for other associated other system anomalies. So even if you encounter a child with anorectal malformation, it is a rule to insert a orogastric tube and ensure that the orogastric tube reaches the stomach to rule out a esophageal atresia. Still, there may be a H fistula which may present on a later life, which may go unnoticed in the newborn period. But it is always a sine qua non or a thumb rule to look for other anomalies. So the Bacterial association stands for vertebral defects, anorectal malformations, cardiac defects, tracheoesophageal fistula, renal anomalies, limb defects, and the latest addition is the Bacterial H, where the H stands for hydrocephalus. So these percentages are very rough percentages. Usually in competitive exams, they may not go into the number game of associations of various anomalies. If they go, it will be really tough. Still, a point worth noting is the cardiac defects stand for roughly 30% of the associated anomalies, wherein the ventricular septal defects and the atrial septal defects and PDA are associated. Renal anomalies, vesicoureteric reflex and renal agenesis. Vertebral anomalies are commonly associated or restricted to the thoracic level, thoracic spine, and anorectal malformations can vary in any of the spectrum, low, intermediate, or high anomalies. Limb defects usually are radial sided limb defects with absent radius and absent thumb. More than three of these components, either three or more than three of these components should be there to categorize or brand a baby to be having a Vactral syndrome. A Vactral association and a Vactral syndrome, they both carry different prognostic significance. A child with a Vactral syndrome may have a poor prognosis. So before branding any child, it is always important to know the criteria. So these are clinical pictures of a child with esophageal atresia with a gross congenital hydrocephalus. And the right-sided picture shows absent thumb and deformity of the upper limb. X-ray showed the radial bone was also absent. So this is about the common presentation and spectrum of anomalies associated with esophageal atresia. The 3 C's of esophageal atresia, which is coughing, choking, and cyanosis immediately after feeds, should be kept in mind. And make it a thumb rule to look for other associated anomalies as for passage of meconium, passage of urine, look for any limb defects, any anomalies in the axial spine in any of these children when you encounter one of the anomalies. So this is a thumb rule. I hope you all keep that in mind. The other deeper questions in esophageal atresia, such as long gap esophageal atresia, surgical management, timing of surgery, post-operative complications. These are all a very wider topic, and I intend to cover in the subsequent sessions. Hope to be connected with you. Let's go to the next question. So this is an interesting question on antenatal diagnosis and intervention, which is slowly picking up in our country owing to a lot of couples with infertility and precious babies, and owing to our lifestyle, age of delivery, all that. So people are willing to spend, willing to invest on their babies, and a few centers are there where antenatal interventions are being successfully carried out. So let's go into the question. Fetal MRI done in a precious baby showed bowel signature in the thoracic region. Interventional procedure is being done, picture attached. Identify the procedure. Basically, bowel signature in the thoracic region. The author means to say that it is an antenatally diagnosed case of congenital diaphragmatic hernia, right? So probably they have investigated the mother and the child, ruled out the chromosomal anomalies, and then they are proceeding with the interventional procedure. Let's see the picture. So the picture shows intact uterus with the fetus in situ, a scope which is going into the oral cavity of the child under ultrasound guidance. And the other two insert pictures below, they are showing the, let me take the pointer. Yeah. These two pictures, they are showing some endoscopic procedure which is being done within the airway. We can see the laryngeal cartilages. I hope you all can notice that. And there is a small balloon-like structure at the tip of the scope. So let's see the various options that are given to us to choose. Option A, chorionic villus sampling. Option B, amniocentesis. Option C, a FETO procedure. And option D, a fetoscopic esophageal calibration. So again, two of the options are easily ruled out: chorionic villus sampling and amniocentesis. In these two, they do not. These are two antenatal investigative modalities, again diagnostic modalities, to look for any chromosomal anomalies and to look for various parameters of or the quality of the Leica ramni. Okay, these two things are done in precious babies, I don't deny, but they do not go anywhere near the fetus. They are done quite away from the baby. So in this, we see that the scope is being inserted into the oral cavity. So we are left with two options: the fetal procedure and a fetal esophageal calibration. Okay, so out of these two, which one would we choose? We can see that there is a balloon-like structure which is being placed inside the fetal airway. So the answer is a FETO procedure. FETO stands for fetal endoscopic tracheal occlusion. The tracheal occlusion in the antenatal period or the fetal period is done in select cases of congenital diaphragmatic hernia to allow the fetal lungs that are being collapsed by the bowel loops to expand. By occluding the airway, we are basically we make the all the secretions that are by occluding the airway, the secretions that are produced by the developing lungs and the distal airways are trapped within the lungs, thereby aiding all the um, pulmonary growth factors and other secretions to be held up within the lungs, thereby mechanically allowing the collapsed lung to expand. This also gives us a beneficial aspect of pushing the bowel loops, which are herniating into the thoracic cavity via the diaphragmatic defect, back into the abdominal cavity. Okay, this is the principle behind the FETO procedure, which stands for fetal endoscopic tracheal occlusion. The balloon that is being placed within the airway, this is again removed. In some centers, they remove it once the lung maturation period gets over, or in some centers, what they do is they do a exit procedure, which is a ex utero intrapartum treatment procedure. EXIT. Exit stands for ex utero intrapartum treatment, wherein at term or whenever the doctors specialists feel that the baby's lung growth has been achieved significantly, and the baby can withstand a delivery, they go in for a elective cesarean section. They open the uterus, they deliver the baby, but even before clamping the cord, the balloon that has been placed in the airway is removed by again a repeat endoscopic procedure. Okay, so that is exit procedure for you. Indications for antenatal intervention in congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Again, all these antenatal diagnostic modalities, antenatal interventions, they are all quite costly and risky both to the mother and to the fetus. These are all undertaken after extensive workup and extensive counseling between a team of specialists with the parents, and the pros and cons are discussed, and then the intervention is undertaken. The FETO consortium have given the indications of precious baby in viable gestation age and the lung head ratio of more than 1.4, which means that if there is a complete collapse of the lung, or if the lung is this ratio is a comparison of the contralateral developing normal lung with the fetal head ratio, fetal head circumference. Okay, if this ratio is more than 4, then there is some point in adopting all these fetal or antenatal interventions. If the baby is found to be having lot of chromosomal anomalies, many associated gross congenital anomalies, external anomalies, then there is no point in um, spending more on these baby, on these fetuses, and also subjecting the mother and the fetus to such extensive interventions. So it has to be always kept in mind to consider the pros and cons of all these antenatal interventions. The Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and the University College San Francisco, the American centers, they undertake a intermittent or a transient fetal occlusion. Um, Whereas the European centers, they go for a long-term fetal occlusion. So what is the, again, a bit of a intricacy into the fetal occlusion therapy. Um, there is a hypothesis that by occluding the airway, uh, there is no circulation, the normal circulation of the Leica rhamni into the respiratory and the aerodigestive tract is being hampered. So this can lead to uh, debilitative effect on the type 2 pneumocytes, which produce the surfactants. Okay, so any intervention, they have both positive and negative aspects. So the American centers, they go for a transient fetal occlusion, whereas the European centers, they go for a long-term fetal occlusion, hoping for a better outcome. But recent prospective studies, they have shown that when there is a liver herniation and when there is very severe cases of CDH, wherein there is poor lung growth, those cases, there is not much of a difference between the group that has undergone antenatal intervention and those that have undergone surgery in the postnatal period. That's an additional tidbit for you. So we have covered the long-term versus short-term tracheal occlusion. The complications of antenatal interventions, again, sorry. The complications, again, we are subjecting the mother for multiple general anesthesias, wherein there is also a risk of severe intrapartum hemorrhage, loss of pregnancy, and risk of infections, iatrogenic infections, and severe chorioamnionitis, even leading to um, death of the mother because of amniotic fluid embolism, hemorrhage, and severe infections. So these are to be kept in mind when counseling the parents and when considering any intervention. So let's go to the next question. Pick the false statement regarding prune belly syndrome. Option A, it is a triad of cryptorchidism, weak abdominal wall musculature, and genitourinary malformations. Option B, recurrent UTI can be a symptom. Option C, it is most common in females. And option D, it is also known as Eagle-Barrett syndrome. Prune belly syndrome, not a very commonly encountered thing, but not so uncommon in pediatric surgical tertiary care centers. Let me give the answer to you. Most common in females is a false statement because prune belly syndrome is commonly encountered in males. So once you see any child with prune belly syndrome, you will never forget this. This infant with prune belly syndrome with a lax abdominal wall musculature with a pot belly. You can even see the gut signature and the bladder, distended bladder here. Okay, and the child has bilateral, impalpable, and descended testis. So once you see a clinical picture of a good index case, you will never forget this lifelong. So let's go into the few tidbits of Prawn-Belly syndrome. Prawn-Belly syndrome is also known as Eagle-Barrett or Obrensky syndrome. Um, the incidence is 1 in 40,000 live births, and predominantly males are affected, around 1.6 is to 1. The characteristic triad or the sine qua non of Prawn-Belly syndrome are the complete or partial weakness of the abdominal wall musculature, undescended testis, usually bilateral, or sometimes it can be unilateral, and usually it is intra-abdominal testis. Genitourinary anomalies such as vesicoureteric reflex and megaureter. Recurrent UTI due to stasis of urine within the bladder, because the child will not be able to develop the necessary intra-abdominal pressure to expel the urine, and there may be associated vesicoureteric reflex. So recurrent UTI is a common presenting feature, but even before all these symptoms develop, the parents find something odd in these babies. They see that the tummy is not right, and they usually get a consult. And non-genitourinary anomalies associated with Prawn-Belly syndrome has been asked previously in one of the exams. The non-GU anomalies commonly associated are malrotation of the gut, ventricular septal defects, musculoskeletal anomalies like pectus excavatum, club feet, and congenital dislocation of hip. So when you notice any child with or suspect any child with Prawn-Belly syndrome, you should always note the orientation of the lower limbs of these children. Treatment considerations given by the mnemonic GOA broadly stands for G stands for genitourinary reconstructions, and O stands for orchidopexy and other anomalies, and A stands for abdominoplasty. The genitourinary reconstructions will be needed for vesicoureteric reflex, either endoscopic reconstruction, endoscopic injection of Dexel or so for controlling VUR, or most commonly, these children have a very high grade VUR necessitating a ureteric reimplant. So usually a bilateral ureteric reimplant, open or vesicoscopic, that's or a robotic, depends on your convenience. A periodic complete emptying of the urinary bladder is the key to avoiding or preventing urinary tract infections. Usually these children will require a staged orchidopexy. This retention of testis intra-abdominally is because of grossly abnormally dilated ureters, so-called bilateral megaureters, which will hamper the normal descent of the testis. And correction of other associated anomalies, which I have mentioned above, because these anomalies will predict the final outcome of the baby, whether they cross beyond the neonatal period or not. If there is an associated malrotation of the gut, the child definitely will need a surgery in the neonatal period. Whereas for the abdominoplasty or genitourinary reconstruction, nobody is going to take up for a neonatal reconstruction, right? And abdominoplasty usually is a pure tissue repair, and it is undertaken once the child has gained adequate weight and is growing sufficiently well without any breakthrough UTIs, right? Let's go to the next question. A 9-year-old male child with a unilateral non-palpable testis underwent a diagnostic laparoscopy in a center. The intra picture is shown on the right side. Pick the best plan of action based on the given intra finding. Option A, proceed with a single stage orchidopexy, a staged orchidopexy, orchiectomy and opposite orchidopexy, or option D, wind up the procedure and leave the child alone. So which one would you choose? This is a child, a quite older child, 9-year-old, probably a neglected child, with a unilateral non-palpable testis. So when the examiner says that it's a non-palpable testis, we assume that they have done all the clinical examination at multiple settings. They have done the examination under anesthesia, and some centers which propose radiological investigations, hormonal tests, and all that. But usually those are not required in unilateral non-palpable testis. And most of us these days we take up diagnostic laparoscopy to exactly localize the testis if the testis is not palpable clinically. So what would we choose in this particular interop finding? So what does this finding show? It is a open, widely open, deep inguinal ring with the intra-abdominal testis just lying close to the deep inguinal ring. The testis looks quite okay, viable, and of good size, but definitely you cannot always say by a photograph alone. You should compare with the opposite side and with the normal volumetry for that particular age. Okay, the nomograms for that particular age should be remembered, but again, there is an MCQ. So this particular testis looks viable, it's of good size, and one can easily identify that it is a testis. So one would always want to preserve it. So the option of orchiectomy is gone. Winding up the procedure and leaving the child alone also is gone, because the intention of surgery is not just to find or localize the testis. We have to always bring it to the satisfactory scrotal position for its good functioning and for post-operative monitoring, to look for any malignant changes in future days. So out of these two, option A and B, which one would you choose? So here is a tricky position. Proceeding with a single stage orchidopexy is done by a few surgeons, wherein they will disconnect the testis from the gubernaculum. The gubernaculum usually will be attached in an abnormal position, leading to the abnormal location of the testis. So they will disconnect the gubernaculum and they will mobilize the testicular vessels to its root or the origin till the renal vessels. And once they feel that the adequate testicular length has been achieved, you can bring it to whatever position you want it to, or whatever position it allows to. But this particular question was was asked in one of the All India Institute exams, and there is a publication which says that any child less than 2 years of age or where the testis is within 2.5 centimeter from the deep inguinal ring, they are amenable for a single stage orchidopexy. Whereas if you attempt a single stage orchidopexy in older children, such as here, which is a 9-year-old child, probably the testicular vessels may not have achieved this necessary length um, proportionate to the height of the child. So if you attempt a single stage orchidopexy, once you divide the gubernaculum, you cannot further proceed with the two-stage procedures. So uh, it is always wiser to pick up a staged procedure in older children than a single stage orchidopexy, because once you divide the gubernaculum, there is no other option but to bring it to whatever position the testis comes down. It may just come close to the superficial ring, or it may lie in the inguinal canal, or you may never reach the scrotum at all, or the testis may reach a high scrotal position, wherein the parents will be ultimately dissatisfied with the location, or the child may develop a recurrence during the growth spurts, during the adolescent period on the growth spurts, when the child grows incrementally, the testicular vessel that one has mobilized may not grow proportionately. So the option or the best answer out of these two options will be a staged orchidopexy in this particular case, and option of a single stage orchidopexy is better avoided. So this is a brief algorithm of management of undescended testes. In a unilateral palpable undescended testes, there is a clear-cut role for clinical examination under anesthesia, and most of the times these parents, they get a radiological investigation done elsewhere, and they come to you with ultrasound showing testis-like structure lying in the inguinal canal. But you may or may not always get this, and you need not go for a imaging procedure in a unilateral, clear-cut, palpable, undescended testis. So if the child is anywhere more than 6 months of age, you can safely take up the child for anesthesia, and you can do an orchidopexy. That is the current standards. If it is a unilateral non-palpable undescended testis, again, in a non-palpable testis, you may wait depending on the facilities in your center to handle neonatal and anesthesia during infancy. But classically, waiting in non-palpable undescended testis do not give a spontaneous resolution or a spontaneous descent. So ultimately, one may have to go for a diagnostic laparoscopy, wherein you can find one of these findings. You can either find a blind ending vessel or an intra-abdominal testis or the vessels which are exiting the internal ring. The vessels here mean the testicular vessels. If there are blind ending vessels and if the deep ring is closed by a membrane, of course, it means that the testis of that particular side has undergone atrophy, probably because of a intranatal vascular accident or a vascular insult. In these cases, you may leave the child alone. So this is the rationale for one of the options in the question, leave the child alone. But nowadays, the authors, some authors, they recommend inguinal exploration and excision of the nubbin or the remnant testicular tissue to prevent a malignant change later on in life. So if it is an intra-abdominal testis, so you may have to decide on a staged or a single staged orchidopexy depending on the condition of the testis, viability of the testis, presence of any other internal anomalies, um, and if the testicular tissue is too negligible, you may do a unilateral orchiectomy of the intra-abdominal testis and fix the opposite side definitely. Always, always remember to fix the opposite normal testis to prevent or to avoid any testicular torsion later in life. Vessels exiting internal ring means that the testis has attempted to descend down normally. It has gone through the inguinal canal, and somewhere in the inguinal canal or one of the ectopic sites it is lying, and you are not able to clinically palpate it. The, the causes for that could be many, starting as simple as from an obese child to testicular vascular insult leading to a testicular nubbin. Okay. In bilateral non-palpable testes, the spectrum of investigations that you need to do are to be oriented towards a disorder of sexual differentiation, what we call a DSD. So bilateral UDT is to be always kept in mind, and detailed evaluation towards DSD should be undertaken with detailed hormonal profile and of course laparoscopy or exploration after HCG stimulation. So I hope this gives a brief outline on management of non-palpable undescended testes. So to conclude, today's session is just a model session to give you the wide range or the range of conditions, clinical conditions that you may encounter as a pediatric surgeon in your career if you opt for it. And definitely a very underrated specialty in our country, but slowly picking up with a lot of avenues with the advent of antenatal interventions, robotics, and you may further subspecialize into pediatric urology, pediatric surgical oncology, or a minimal access surgery if you wish to. And most of the times, pediatric surgery, unless there is somebody in the family or somebody in the whom you have personally seen and gotten inspired, it is not a first choice for most of the candidates. Um, but the type of questions that are commonly being asked in sequential examinations are slowly being escalated to higher levels. So we would suggest you, rather than sticking on to the general surgical textbooks, the pediatric surgical section of the general surgical textbooks, it is wiser to go into the intricacies of the field and get a first-hand information from people who have already gone through it and who have done it. So we are there to help you out with these particular sections so that you need not scratch your head on preparing on all these topics, high yield topics. So I'm sure NEET Assure uh, will be supporting all of you with their test packages, and that's it for today. Thank you all.